Hello, welcome to the Nexus Podcast. Here, we're all about connecting anyone and everyone with our environment. We'll aim to do this through sharing knowledge and discussing various topics that show people how they can be better connected to nature and the world we live in. At the end of each episode, we'll also provide some actionable steps that anybody can take to help make our world a better place. I believe that the impact of everyday people can be profound if we all act and strive to leave the world in a better way than we found it, especially our environment. We'll try to keep things enlightening, informative, and educational. I'd love anyone and everyone to be able to listen and enjoy tuning in. I hope we can be the nexus between you and the beautiful world we live in and so rely on. This is Jessica York bringing you another episode of Nature's Nexus. Let's go. Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Nature's Nexus. Today on the podcast we have a guest, Dr. Eric Nordberg, with us. And Eric is going to talk to us today about biodiversity on solar farms. So hello and welcome, Eric.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
No worries. Thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate your time. And I'm very excited to have this conversation because I've been seeing so many things in the social media lately and just, things evolving in the renewable space and seeing how this impacts our local biodiversity. So I think this will be a great conversation.
Yep, it's definitely a hot topic at the moment.
It is. Cool. So before I introduce you to all the listeners, I'll ask a couple of questions that I like to ask everybody when they come on the podcast. And the first one is, what is it that you love most about our natural world?
I think I love the diversity and the resilience of all the different species. So almost no matter where you go in the world, you can find new and interesting things, whether that's, pristine areas, rainforests, habitats and things like that, or even around your local garden, you can still find lots of cool birds and insects and lizards and things like that. And so I just really like the diversity of different things that you can find, and the fact that they can live alongside even some pretty kind of disturbed habitats and altered areas, again, like housing developments and even in the cities and things like that. So I just really like having the ability to find a lot of those natural things, kind of no matter where you go.
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. And I love that because it is so diverse. And I often see that a lot, with ecology is people could be an expert in one area, but if they move for 4 hours up the road, it'll be completely different fauna or plants. And they're just back to square one with learning what the species are in that area.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, cool. And the second question is, how do you get connected to nature, or when do you feel the most connected to nature?
I just like your good old-fashioned bushwalk. I try and get out and just enjoy nature. Again, it can be something as simple as going through a walk through the neighborhood, listening to the birds or frogs calling, or going on a hike in a new national park when I'm traveling around or visiting a new area. Again, to try and see all the new species that I may not have seen before, or revisiting some old classic sites that I really enjoy. So yeah, I just like getting out in nature, bringing some binoculars and a camera, and just kind of enjoying the space.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Okay, well, everybody, for those of you who may not have come across Eric or his work before, Eric is a senior lecturer and wildlife ecologist at the University of New England, whose research sits at the intersection of landscape management, biodiversity conservation, and renewable energy. With a multidisciplinary background, Eric's work explores how landscape change, driven by factors like fire, agriculture, and the rapid expansion of wind and solar farms, impact wildlife communities and ecosystem health. He is particularly passionate about developing win-win strategies that balance the needs of industry, landholders, and conservation, ensuring that sustainable land use and biodiversity protection can go hand in hand. Eric's research is highly collaborative, involving partnerships with government agencies, industry, Indigenous ranger groups, and international experts. He leads and contributes to major projects on the environmental effects of renewable energy, including the AgroSolar CRC bid, and is recognised as an invited expert in the emerging field of ecovoltaics. As an educator, Eric is dedicated to hands-on field-based learning, mentoring students from undergraduate through to PhD level, and fostering the next generation of ecologists. Eric's work has been featured in National Geographic, newspapers, magazines, podcasts, public forums, and as an invited speaker to international conferences. He is committed to science communication, community engagement, and translating research into real-world solutions for people and wildlife alike. So Eric has a wealth of knowledge, and it's going to be so fun talking about everything on these topics today. And fun fact, Eric was my supervisor for my honors at university, so that's how I know Eric, and he has mentored me, and he is wonderful at what he does. So
So
let's,
perfect example of all the things and where people can go, I guess. So you've
yeah.
been mentoring people to have their own podcast.
Yes, exactly. Cool. Okay, well, let's jump into it and talk a bit about maybe the background and, the changing Australian landscape as it is lately. So maybe, Eric, you could introduce us to how Australia's landscapes are rapidly changing due to factors, such as agricultural intensification, climate change, and maybe the expansion of renewable energy infrastructure, such as the solar and wind farms, which is what we're really seeing a lot in our area in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as most people will probably be familiar, the kind of the discussions and key points in politics and on social media and all kinds of things around renewables has really become more prevalent in the last few years. And that's really as a kind of a goal or a change to switch from our reliance on things like fossil fuels into more renewable and sustainable energy sources. So things like wind farms, large scale solar projects, and things like hydro, all in the news and in the media. And while I think probably most people would agree that stepping away from things like fossil fuels is a good idea, um, a lot of people still have questions about whether or not renewables are either the answer or um, kind of the background in rolling those new energy sources out, and how can we do that without kind of a trade-off in kind of destroying the habitats that those sites will be on. So I guess kind of putting it simply, the major concerns I think that a lot of people will hear, again, in the news or in the media, these discussions, is that renewables are, a good thing for, again, getting us off fossil fuels, but they take up a lot of land, right? So if you think of these large scale solar farms, they're really large, they're expansive. And so from a farmer's perspective, you can imagine there's concerns about, well, what's that land going to be like now that there's solar panels on it? Is that taking away from prime agricultural land that might be used for things like cropping or grazing? Or from the other side of the fence, you might have people that are talking about, well, what about the biodiversity and the wildlife habitat that area could support? And so are we basically trading renewable energy for wildlife habitat or trading renewable energy for agricultural practices? And so I think that's really where the debate comes, is trying to identify how best we can use that land, and is one actually better for the area than the other.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's so many topics there that everybody is talking about right now that we do worry about. And it's probably an answer that takes a while to do the research behind to see where it's actually going to take us. Like anything, we don't know straight away. So, we see a lot of these changes in our area within the New England region of Australia. So, what are some of the things we're seeing with the changes in this area in particular, and all the solar and wind farms that are going up?
Yeah, so the New England has been designated as a renewable energy zone, and there's a few zones of these RES areas, the renewable energy zones throughout the country, and they're basically kind of targeted areas that have been designated for renewables because they either have high wind, and so they'll be good for wind farms, or there's lots of cleared areas that would be good for large scale solar projects and things like that. But also they might be in areas that are close to the infrastructure grid to connect these projects to main power lines and things like that. So here in the New England, obviously we're in the New England renewable energy zone, and so we have lots of these types of projects popping up all over the place. Some are already up and running, and there's many more that are slated for our region in order to kind of power this growing renewables kind of boost that we're seeing across the country. And so a lot of these kind of questions, again, are kind of focusing on how does the change or the structure of these things. So again, I'll mostly be talking about solar today, given that's where most of my work has been. What does a solar farm do to the landscape, and basically what's the impact? Is there positives or negatives that are associated with the development of a solar farm in respect to whether that land is now in better or worse condition than maybe it was previously?
Yeah, for sure. I know sometimes when you drive past and you just see paddocks and paddocks covered in the solar panels, and you really wonder, what's going on and is this good or bad? And like anything, there's so many pros and cons. So I guess, that's where you see all these different challenges coming in. Can you maybe explain some of those challenges that we see when we're looking at a paddock full of solar panels?
Yeah, so I guess from the first once panels get put on site and are constructed, well, even I guess before then, there's obviously lots of planning and kind of zoning and all kinds of kind of background policy work that has to go in before these large state infrastructures can be built. But to kind of simplify things, basically there's a couple of ways that this can work. So either a company can buy the land outright and then they can develop it, put their solar panels on and manage that landscape independently. And in those cases, they're buying some of the farmers' land, obviously compensating them for that land, and then the solar company can do what they want with that particular area. Or the other option, and some of those options we see here in the New England, is where basically the solar company will lease the land from various landholders. It may include a whole bunch of different landholders, depending on the geographic layout and the size of the different paddocks that they want to use. And then the farmer can then use that land to, say, graze their sheep underneath the solar panels. And so in that case, the solar farm is essentially paying for the use of the land. But then the farmer can also use that land as well. And this is where we start to begin integrating what I kind of like to call these kind of win-win concepts, or these land sharing schemes, where the landscape can be used for more than one purpose. And I think this is really the important thing with a lot of these arguments, is that renewable energy doesn't have to just be, quote unquote, clean energy production. It can also be used for other things if we're strategic about how this actually plays out. And I'll go into a couple of examples of how this might work. So the first and probably most obvious in our region is the grazing aspect. So again, we get a lot of people that are interested in understanding how solar rollouts will affect grazing properties. And so if you're in a situation where you've got a large solar farm, vegetation management is really one of those, key things that a solar company is concerned with. So they have to keep that vegetation low so that it doesn't shade the panels. That obviously reduces the production of energy, but also to keep that vegetation low enough so that it's not bushfire risk is also really important. And so, as you can imagine, because of the large footprint of these sites, it takes a long time to manage that vegetation. And so you can either spray chemicals, but again, people are trying to avoid that because it leaches chemicals into the ground, and it's also extremely expensive. And so you can either mow or slash that vegetation underneath the panels, but that means you have to use small enough equipment to kind of drive in between the panel rows. So that obviously takes a lot of effort and time. And so, a solar company is paying, weeks and weeks of somebody driving around a tractor slashing all of this vegetation. Or the other option is to use sheep to do it. So given that we need that vegetation to be controlled, if they engage local landholders and say, hey, do you have sheep? I'll let you graze on my land. That way, basically, the sheep get free food, and the solar company gets free vegetation management. And so you're working together then to manage that system so that you have a shared problem, too much grass, and one person benefits from it by having sheep eat it, and the other party benefits from it by keeping that grass down. So that's one example of one of these kind of land sharing schemes that ends in a quote unquote win-win, where we can have basically the same land being used for multiple purposes, so that neither one of them has to bear the brunt of the negative impacts.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes complete sense to do that. Like, I can't imagine them mowing around every single solar panel and underneath it and those sorts of things. But then, so I might be jumping ahead here, but then have you noticed what your research has shown on if you've got sheep grazing under these solar panels? I guess that's pretty similar to just having sheep grazing in a paddock in general. But have you seen the solar panels in regards to the native biodiversity in the area or the native wildlife, where that comes in?
Yeah, so I guess to pitch it in the other direction, another potential win-win is so that you can have, and this is really where my research is trying to kind of dive a bit deeper in, is to identify, well, what what biodiversity, what wildlife and vegetation and all that kind of thing is on a normal, New England farm, a typical paddock that might get transformed into a solar farm. And then how does that change once you put solar on it? So I'm really interested in identifying what the community of, wildlife per se and biodiversity is like within a solar farm, and how that is either the same, degraded, or better than what it previously was before the solar farm was built. And so I'm interested in understanding, well, what wildlife can still live in a solar farm. And when you think about, again, the context of these large scale solar farms, they take up a lot of space. They all have these perimeter fences around them. So there's not really people or anything, in those solar farms, or at least not all that often. And so in my mind, it's kind of like a little mini nature preserve. There's not a lot of disturbance going on in there. All of a sudden, you've got this infrastructure in there, but I'm hoping that this kind of acts as like a three-dimensional artificial shrubs and trees. So a lot of our farmland has already been cleared historically. So there's not a lot of shrubs and trees in general anyway. There are lots of cleared paddocks for grazing and agricultural practices. And so even though there is still wildlife that will live on a grazed farmland, if we add in more structural complexity to that system, we now add these different shade and sun patches from the solar panels. And maybe if we have strategic designs where we don't just have a giant sea of panels everywhere, but we have, little blocks of panels scattered around. And in between those panels, we have, we keep bushes or small shrubs, things like that. Now, all of a sudden, we've got a much more complex environment, and that's a lot more biodiversity and creates a whole bunch more little microhabitats, so that, again, maybe you're a small lizard and you want to bask in the sun. And so you can walk from underneath the panel into the sun. And then when you get too warm, you shuttle back under into the shade. Whereas if you're trying to cross a big paddock that only has a couple of trees, maybe you're restricted in the time periods that you're actually able to be out foraging around, because you're just going to get too hot if you are in the sun the whole time. So this is kind of similar to a concept that's similar to artificial reefs. So if you think about, we have lots of reef die-off and things like that around corals. And to try and boost that kind of structural complexity, people often put in either fake reef, and it's either, different structures. Some people, it's as simple as even tires or cement blocks and things like that, to basically create a whole bunch of different shapes and diversity underwater. And then you have fish that like little caves, live inside the bricks, and fish that live, on the outsides in the shadows. They are swimming around on those areas. So I kind of envision these kind of large scale solar as potential, almost like a terrestrial version of an artificial reef. With proper planning, we might be able to actually create a more complex ecosystem that allows a whole bunch of different species to live in and around some of those areas.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. So you're talking about the idea of potentially changing the configuration of the solar farms to allow like other natural elements in, or change the layout slightly to accommodate more wildlife.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think we generally think of solar farms as, like these giant sea of panels. It's just an enormous, big rectangle blob, basically. And they don't necessarily have to be that way. That might be the most efficient way for, a developer to just say, all right, well, we're just going to make, 50,000 rows of panels, and that's what it is. Might be easier to manage. But if we can be involved in the design phase as well, talk to these developers and have them, interact with ecologists and landscape managers and, planners and landholders, all in the beginning phases, then we might be able to say, all right, well, look, this one little section of the area that you want to develop is actually really good marshland. And so if we just don't put panels there, and we kind of shift that over to the left a little bit and leave a little gap, then all of a sudden you can keep that microhabitat that's really important for certain species. And by having, basically little module, scatter patches of solar panels, it might give us the opportunity to create more connectivity through farmlands. We might actually be able to rehabilitate some of those areas so that there's better connectivity of habitat and creating these travel corridors than what was originally there when it was just a farmland. So, I mean, without kind of jumping the gun, the dream is that basically a solar farm with the right planning and strategic management might actually support more biodiversity than what it existed as just a farmland, because we might have this kind of extra planting of either native vegetation underneath the panel, so that it's native grasses instead of weeds, or maybe, yeah, you're planting shrub buffers on the edge so that it catches the dust from a dirt road on the outside. And so all of a sudden, that's a win-win in of itself. The solar panels aren't getting the dust from the road, but also you've now created a windbreak that's good for sheep, but also you've now created a whole line of bushes or vegetation that is good for small birds and mammals and things like that. So I think in the design space, there's a whole lot that we can be doing to make
Mm.
sure that it's not just a giant blob of solar panels.
Yeah, and there's so many good ideas if there was just a bit more intensive planning that could potentially be taken on board. But I suppose there's still the challenge of things like trees probably aren't going to be incorporated, but I guess you could at least meet halfway by getting the smaller species that might go, like, as you say, under the panels or in the shrubs that you could at least help.
Yeah, exactly. And so, given that the footprint of these big projects is fairly large, you probably wouldn't have, the boundary right up against panels anyway. And so,
Mm.
say you planted trees or you retained trees, 20 meters away from the nearest panel,
Mm.
the shade that one tree is going to cast, was only going to reach so far, even on, the most winter day or whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
And so it may not be that you have to clear everything. Those areas could still be useful as long as they're kind of in strategic areas on the outside.
Yeah. Be cool. I was just envisioning it'd be cool if they made like a row of trees around the outside of the solar farms. That could almost be a
Yeah,
good way to do connectivity, like leading up to it, then around it and keep going on. But there's a lot of trees, a lot of space. So, talked about agrivoltaics and conservoltaics. Did you want to lead into that
yeah.
next?
Yep. So
Yeah.
that's a good segue. So these are kind of the two leading kind of concepts on how we should deal with these systems. So agrivoltaics is basically agriculture plus photovoltaics. Photovoltaics being large scale solar farms, and so that's that land sharing scheme where you're basically combining agriculture and
Oh, yes. Yeah.
solar energy development. And again, it could be grazing. So I talked a lot about those examples of why the benefits of grazing might be good under panels, but this can also be cropping. So depending on where you are geographically, maybe you're not a livestock grazer, but you grow crops. And so again, if you go into it knowing that this is going to have, or you want to have crops growing underneath panels, you can strategically plant shade tolerant species, so things like lettuce or onions and things like that grow well in the shade. They can thrive underneath solar panels. And again, then you're not giving up agricultural land for solar development. You can do it hand in hand. And in some cases, there are areas where agrivoltaic systems are strategically planned, so they know this is going to happen. And so those panels might be slightly wider than normal, or they might be slightly higher than normal to get special machinery in to, pick tomatoes and other crops and things like that. So again, knowing what you want to use the site for before it's constructed is always beneficial, rather than going, oh, you know what would have been great is if we would have raised these panels by 30 centimeters, then we could have gotten this machine in. Like, that's obviously a much bigger ask to do retrospectively than to go, look, this is the plan from the beginning, and we know we're going to do this. And the same concept with grazing. So again, if you know you're going to have sheep under there, you probably want that vegetation growing underneath the panels to be, something that's very nutritious and good for your livestock. So
Mm.
you might actually want to reseed it after the solar farm's been constructed. You plant a whole bunch of seeds for whatever it is that you want growing there, whether that's native species, if you're interested in having wildflowers and biodiversity benefits, or some specialized grass that's really good for sheep growth, for example. And again, then you're not relying on just whatever's in the seed bank, and that might be a weedy mixture from whatever the farm was previously. We can kind of target those things to be much more specific. And the same concepts go for conservoltaics. So this is a term that we've developed, again, to basically combine nature conservation and photovoltaics. In parts of the US and Europe, they've kind of developed this at the same time. They call it ecovoltaics. And so again, just in integrating any kind of environmental or ecological systems into solar energy. But again, what we're focusing on is making those areas suitable for wildlife habitat and how can we improve those areas through strategic management and planning. So again, a lot of the recommendations when you do things like an environmental impact assessment beforehand, before the site gets built, you might say, oh, yes, we have to remove X number of trees, and they contain tree hollows. So there might be a mitigation measure where, all right, well, you need to put up nest boxes, for example. And we go, all right, well, we want to know, are those nest boxes actually being built and are they actually being occupied? And so there's a big element of monitoring to figure out, well, what we're recommending, is anybody actually doing it and is it actually working? So again, you can imagine if we put up a bunch of nest boxes, but then we never go back and check them. Well, if they never get occupied, then are we actually replacing those tree hollows that were felled? And so I think that's another kind of big recommendation that we have, that we've been trying to push out, is that we need to monitor this long term. All this data is really new to us. This is kind of a new ecosystem that we haven't really had any data on yet. And even though there's some good information out of Europe and places like that, they're very different systems than Australia. Obviously, we've got very different species, but some of the kind of general trends, again, we still just don't know. Again, how often do people go back through and actually monitor things? A company might have been allocated that, yes, you're going to have to put up nest boxes, but did they actually do it? Like, is anybody actually checking those things? So
Yeah.
and I think those are some of those kind of key things that we need to make sure we're actually jumping into and checking on. Otherwise, we're making all these recommendations and nobody knows if it's actually working. So we don't want to do this for the next 20 years and go, oh, well, nobody actually thought to check on these things to see if it was actually worth doing.
Yeah, to follow it up. So I guess this is where your research comes in with following up this sort of thing, right? And seeing how all the interactions go leading forward. And other people as well. Like you said, it was overseas. So that's where, this sense of global research comes in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is really where, again, because it's such a new system, again, we don't really have a lot of good data on it. So I've started collecting some data locally while we're applying for grants and trying to get some of these big partners on board. But that's often, a tricky task. A lot of these companies, they're not required to do or fund research, whereas some companies are really interested in this space and they want to have a very, green and, a net gain on biodiversity by on their solar farm. So you get all kinds of different companies and groups that have different viewpoints. But yes, we've been doing some broad scale biodiversity surveys here at the University of New England. We have our own little solar farm at the back of the campus that actually powers a big chunk of our academic campus. Really cool. And it also makes a really great place for, a pilot study to have students do some work and test out their skills on species ID and things like that. And we also use it for a teaching space. So again, I teach a lot of these concepts to all the zoology and ecology students going through their degrees, so that they get some real world experience and kind of real questions that our region is facing.
Yeah, and bring the new generations up to speed on all the challenges they might face in the industry now, what's being developed. Yeah, so I guess that leads us into your current research. So did you want to tell us a bit about, the landscape change impacts that you've currently noticed with the wildlife, with maybe from climate change in general, or whatever most of your research has been looking at lately?
Yep. So I guess to combat climate change, we've got this big push to develop more renewable energy strategies, which, as we've been talking about, changes the landscape. And so I've just had a student finish up a master's project, Ramo, and he was interested in looking at basically what the biodiversity is like on a solar farm compared to adjacent farmland. And so we used the University of New England's solar farm as our study site. And so for about 3 years, we collected some really broad scale fauna survey data on those two sites. So we did things like bird surveys in the mornings. We did some trapping. So we used pitfall traps, funnel traps for small animals like small rodents, amphibians, reptiles, snakes, things like that. We had Elliott traps and cage traps to look at small and medium-sized mammals. We had wildlife cameras. We flipped coverboard objects to look at invertebrates and all kinds of skinks and snakes and things like that. So we really tried to hit as many different groups as we could. And we did this repeatedly, kind of 2 times throughout the year, kind of in spring and then in summer, over the course of a couple of years. And what Ramo found was basically that the wildlife community assemblage was actually quite similar between the farmland and the solar farm. Obviously, there are species differences. And so things like birds that are easily able to move and obviously can fly between those two areas fairly easily. We didn't really see any difference between the community composition of birds. Our mammal groups were slightly different. And so what we found was basically in the farm habitat, we found all of the bigger animals, so things like wallabies and kangaroos and things that we didn't find in the solar farm. And that's really, we think, due to the infrastructure. So
Yeah, the fence is keeping them out.
exactly. So having those kind of chain link fences, obviously we know fences aren't impenetrable, and things will eventually get in and out. But for the most part, it kept a lot of the big animals out of the solar farm. And so that's where we saw more in the farmland. And then similarly with the reptiles and amphibians, even though we still found a fair amount in the solar farm, they were less abundant and a little bit less diverse in the solar farm. And we think that's because the micro habitats that you typically find those animals, so things like rock piles and logs, are generally cleared out of a solar farm. And so,
Yeah.
as you would imagine, if you're setting up a bunch of panels, you don't want to have to mow around a giant rock pile or a big down log, even though that's really good wildlife habitat. And so, what kind of came out of those preliminary surveys from Ramo's work is that we're now interested in trying to provide recommendations on how to basically reintegrate some of those microhabitats into a solar array so that those areas can be kind of rehabilitated, if you will, with some rock piles or down logs in those periphery areas and things like that, to try and encourage some of those species that we don't already have to recolonize some of those areas.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where that conservoltaics research comes in and developing the multi-use landscapes to try and benefit everything. Because, yeah, it sounds like it'd be sort of somewhat simple, maybe not necessarily easy, but sort of solution to bring them back in. And you mentioned
Yeah,
with the
exactly.
birds, them being in there, is that because they're simply, you're still seeing the same amount of birds in and out because they're coming in to feed? That's why they'd mostly be in the solar farms?
Yeah, so different species do different things, and visibility again could also be playing into that. And acknowledging that the university's solar farm is fairly small, birds can come and go quite easily. Once we get into, we started collecting some data on some of the really big solar farms in the area, and so we hope to tease this out a little bit more to see if it's just animals are moving in and out, and that's why we didn't really see those differences, or are the specific types of feeding birds doing different things. So things that like rosellas and things like that like to hop around on the ground feeding, seem to be happy to do that in a solar farm just as easily as is in a farmland. Whereas, your hollow dwelling species, they may not necessarily be able to thrive in a solar farm unless there's, remnant hollows in that area or, hollow boxes and things like that. So hopefully time will tell on some more of those kind of specialty groups, and how they start to play out.
Yeah, it'd be exciting to see what the research brings off the bigger solar farms. Have you had any findings so far, or are you still bringing some things together?
Yeah, we've just done some preliminary surveys down near Dubbo on a big solar farm down there, and that's an interesting site. So they're really interested in trying to support biodiversity on site, and so that kind of patchy arrangement that I was speaking about, they've already done actually. And so it's not just a giant sea of panels, and so we've got kind of three different treatment areas that we're collecting this kind of data. So within solar panel arrays, just like a normal solar farm, in what we're calling control areas. So this is basically areas within the solar farm that weren't developed. So it's still the remaining grassland habitat that it used to be, the same as the adjacent farmland. And then a third group, which we're calling kind of this rehabbed site. So anytime they had to remove tree stumps, or rocks and things like that, rather than just mulching them up, they basically dumped them into little paddocks adjacent to some of these solar farms. So when you look at it, there's kind of almost looks like a little graveyard of tree stumps and boulders and things like that. And so we're looking at basically that area as well as a potential rehabbed area. And so far, it's doing exactly what we expected. We find higher number of things like frogs and lizards and stuff in those areas because again, what we expect is that um, the presence of those microhabitats have allowed those species to remain in those areas, whereas it's all been cleared out from underneath the panels. So basically, it means that an animal might be, displaced from the actual footprint of the solar panels, but they might still be able to thrive in that general area as long as these little patches still exist. So that's really interesting, and hopefully we can convince more solar companies to grant us access and help in that kind of preliminary design phase, so that we can keep those kind of structures in place rather than, like I said, just mulching up all the dead trees and things like that.
Yeah, especially if they're already there, like why not, you know? So when you were saying that they've currently got them outside the solar farm, but you can sort of use that principle to say that it would essentially be very similar if they were just inside the solar farm instead and more
Yeah,
accessible
well,
to.
they are actually in the solar
Oh,
farm,
they are.
so
Yeah.
they're outside of the actual panels, but
Right.
the whole footprint of the solar farm, they're still within the main
Oh, okay.
solar array. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's exciting that they're sort of already incorporating it. So hopefully if you just they grow on to that, that would be exciting to see what that could lead to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so with the developing the rock piles and the logs, it's sort of like developing its own little microclimate, and that's really drawing all the wildlife into that little area. Did you want to talk a bit more about that and how you monitor those little microclimates and how we can keep an eye on them?
Yeah, so microclimates have really come up in the discussion recently, and so we talked about kind of on a bigger scale that adding these solar panels is going to add things like shade and sun patches to the environment. And so when we talk about a microclimate, we're talking about basically habitats, but on a very small scale. And so again, you might think underneath a panel, it's shaded, and so the temperature is going to be lower than if you're in between a panel. You've got the sunshine, it's going to be warmer. Underneath a panel, it might have higher humidity because it's shaded. There might be more or less vegetation growing there, or different types of vegetation. Again, more shade tolerant species and that
Mm.
kind of thing. So the specifics about those microclimates is really of interest to both farmers and ecologists, because that dictates what kind of things you will find in a particular area. So we've begun a collaboration with some people in the U.S., a student in Germany, and myself, to basically build some real fancy microclimate sensors. And so what we are trying to do is basically map out what the conditions are like across a solar farm. Again, especially underneath panels, in between panel rows, and in those areas. So
And
we want to look
sorry,
at
under the panels, Eric, they sort of they the panels move a bit according to the sun, do they, or just are all the panels static?
there's a couple different types. So you can have static, what they're called fixed panels. And
Mm.
so that's like what the UNE solar farm has, where it's basically built to face the suns and it doesn't rotate.
Yeah,
The newer kind of models are a rotating panel, and so it
yeah.
has a pivot point in the middle, and it
Mm.
tracks. It's called a tracking system, and so when the sun comes up, it's pointing, to the east, and then as the day goes on, it slowly moves with the sun to maximize its input.
Yeah.
So well, I guess depending on the design of your solar farm or the panels that you're using, some will have that shade patch slightly move
Yeah, I was just
if
thinking
the
it would
panel is
affect
moving.
the microclimate. Yeah,
Yes, exactly.
yeah.
Um, and so depending on what the kind of the construction and the engineering is, and what panels you're using, we're interested to know how that influences temperature, humidity, things like soil moisture and soil condition, even things like wind speed and solar absorptive power and all that kind of stuff. Um, One, just so that we know how it affects the system. So again, whether you've got different vegetation growing underneath panels, is that going to reduce erosion when you have heavy rains? There's also, as you can imagine, when it is wet or when you have heavy dew, all the water runs off the panel, and so it creates a drip line. So right where the panel ends, all the water drips off there. So you have this nice wet area right
Yeah.
where the panels end. And so, from a farmer's perspective, they're interested in knowing this because there are certain parasites that grow naturally in agricultural systems, and they have particular microclimates that they thrive in as well. And for some of them, it might be moist, cool areas where
Mm.
the eggs incubate much better. And so if a solar farm is creating that microclimate, then you're potentially increasing the amount of parasites growing for that particular species. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they need to be dry and warm, and so that microclimate is not good. And so by identifying what's actually happening in those microclimates, we can use that to predict how bad certain parasites are going to be, and farmers are going to be interested in knowing that. And that might also influence the sheep's behavior. Do they hang out underneath panels all the time because it's shaded and they want to stay cool? And maybe that then increases the fleece quality. They're not wandering around in the sun and wandering through shrubs, stuff like that, getting burrs and stuff in their fleece. And so there's a whole suite of things from the grazing agricultural side of things that's useful for, but also for predicting habitat suitability for wildlife. So there's lots of programs that you can kind of look at occupancy modeling and see, well, what kind of conditions are really good for species X? And you might be able to plug in, well, this is what the temperature is, and this is what the soil moisture is, and all that kind of stuff, and gives us a much better idea of where animals might actually be and how suitable these big solar farms might be from a wildlife perspective as well.
Yeah, that's super exciting that developing that sensor, and it sounds like it could, tell you so much information and really help the research along, and then be an amazing resource for, the farmers and the people who own the solar farms and, with their management of them. Do you have an ETA on the development, or it's still very much unpredictable?
It's pretty early stages. We do have a
Mm.
prototype, so you can buy sensors that do this, commercially, but they're a couple $1,000s. And
Yeah.
so it obviously takes a lot of money. And if you want more than just one sensor, obviously, it
Yeah.
takes, a
Yeah.
fairly big grant to pull that in. So I've got a
Yes.
student that's working to develop a very cheap version using things like Raspberry Pis, little micro sensor microcontrollers, just basically a little computer chip, and you
Hmm.
develop and design it to do whatever you want.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and so and so he's basically built a replicate version of a sensor, a commercially available sensor that might cost $5,000.
Mm.
His will be a couple $100. And so
Yeah.
we're hoping that will reduce the cost, and then we can deploy a whole bunch of them across the landscape. So hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have
Mm.
some really good working prototypes going, and collecting that kind of data.
Yeah, hopefully. That's so cool. What's the idea? Do they need to go on every panel or just the end of every row or?
They don't need to be all over the place, but we want to make sure that we have enough replication so that if certain panels or certain land conditions, the soil
Oh, yes.
properties and things underneath one spot is affecting it, we've got enough of them replicated around the place that we can pick up all the variation. So, we'd like to have more than a couple, but it doesn't need to be, thousands and thousands of them.
Yeah, yeah, I see. Yeah, awesome. So what's your work look like going forward? Where to from here?
Well, I'm currently on a sabbatical, and so I've got the next few months off from my teaching, and I'm traveling to the US and to the UK to meet up with some of their leading solar experts to work on some collaborations, work on some of this microclimate stuff, and also look for kind of new partnerships and ways that we can collaborate and share knowledge from areas that have had a lot of solar deployment in the past. Given that Australia is fairly new in this space, hopefully we can learn what's worked and what hasn't worked for some of those areas. And so in a couple of weeks' time, I have a colleague from the US who works for the Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute is coming to Armidale. And he's going to spend a week here where we're going to do a public forum in town, and also a seminar here at the university about kind of what they know, what's worked, what hasn't, opportunities for research in trying to build biodiversity on solar farms. And then later in the year, I'll join him in the States, and we'll keep working on that. So lots of new things working coming up in the future. And yeah, it's all about kind of building partnerships and collaborations, not only with universities, but again, landholders, industry groups. So we're always looking for solar farms to allow us onto their property to collect some data. We're looking for partners to put in for grants and funding schemes. But again, a lot because this includes so many people in so many different areas. It's a very kind of big community that it impacts. So we're also interested in the community members, what they think. How do farmers want to be involved? If they've got solar on their property, what kind of questions are they interested in knowing? Does this make the animal production side of things better or worse, or how can we help them answer some questions as well? So we're always interested in kind of pulling all that kind of information together.
Yeah, for sure. And it's such amazing work. And it'd be good having some collaboration to help, everyone talk about ideas together and develop the space and enhance all the learning. So that's amazing. Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we finish up? I think we're starting to come to a bit of an end on our discussion.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. We've covered the main gist of things.
Yep. Awesome. Oh, well, thank you so much for coming on, Eric. Really appreciate your time. And I love talking about this. It's a really interesting space. And I think the work you're doing is very exciting and amazing and worthwhile. Be great to see what comes of it all.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks for having me, and yeah, the opportunity to talk about this in kind of an open format where it's not we're pro renewables or we're against renewables. Again, I think we're moving that direction. So this is our opportunity to figure out what works and how can we do it with the least number of negative impacts as possible.
Yeah, and just have those open conversations. Yeah. So I love to leave an actionable step with everybody at the end of each episode. So do you have an actionable step that you think people could take away from today's episode that anybody could do?
Yeah, I guess get involved with the projects that are happening in your area. So if you're concerned about what's going to happen or how they're going to be managed, reach out to your local groups, see if they're supporting research on site, ask those questions. And I guess the one thing we didn't talk about a whole lot is kind of the social license of these things. So the community really holds the power in how these big companies have to live and thrive and perform in these regional areas. And so if there's enough pressure to investigate certain things, whether that's again from a land or an agricultural perspective or a biodiversity perspective or both, that really catches their ear. And that's even happened here in the New England where some companies have reached out to us saying, look, we're hearing a lot of concerns about the grass quality underneath panels. So we'd like to fund a project that investigates that. So if enough people kind of raise those concerns, we can actually address those questions. And so I guess that would be my action is that, reach out to people, voice your opinion, go to those public forums, and pitch those constructive recommendations rather than just saying, oh, we don't want solar here. Well, solar's already here and it's probably going to stay. So rather than saying we don't want it, which isn't going to really help anybody, ask those questions on, well, how can we do this better? And can you fund research to investigate how we can do this optimally?
Yeah, for sure. I love that. Yeah, take action and help make a positive change. Yeah, awesome. Oh, well, if this conversation sparked interest in any of our listeners, maybe you could even go a step further and look Eric up as a supervisor for your studies. I'm sure
Absolutely.
always looking to take on students, and I think you're currently looking for a PhD student at the moment, Eric, or did you find somebody?
No, that's true. We are looking for at least one PhD student. Again, we've got a lot of things in the works. So definitely looking for someone to step in to do some more biodiversity work in this space. But we also have lots of irons in the fire for the agricultural space as well. So if you're interested in anything renewables, whether that's wildlife habitat, grazing actions, vegetation assessments, soil properties, any of that kind of stuff, reach out. Hopefully Jess can pass on my contact details.
Yes.
And yeah, we'd love to chat and see where you can be suitable for a particular project.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I will definitely share your details with everybody. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, Eric.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Nature's Nexus podcast. I hope you enjoyed it and found some value in what was shared today. I look forward to presenting more knowledge and sharing ways we can connect to nature in future episodes and hope you tune in with me to listen, learn, and act. Thank you, and until next time.